Well, the Canary Girls, well, I discovered the idea for the Canary Girls when I was researching and writing Switchboard Soldiers. Because when the women who served in the US Army Signal Corps were traveling from the United States to France, they stopped over in the British Isles. So I needed to research what was going on in Great Britain at that time. What would my telephone operators have seen? What would they observe as they were crossing England to get from this landing point to this departure point? And what I discovered was fascinating. My characters arrived there in 1918. So, of course, at this point, Great Britain had already endured, 4 years, nearly 4 years of just devastating war. And what my American women discovered was that women were filling in all sorts of professions and all sorts of occupations that had been denied them before. They were considered, jobs that weren't suitable for women, and men were filling these positions. But with so many of the men serving overseas or lost already, never to return home, the labor that was available were women. And so women were filling in as streetcar operators, as mail carriers, as mechanics. And of course, they were filling in the factories. And I focused in on what were called the munitionettes, who served in the munitions factories. Sometimes they were building airplanes, sometimes they were building bombs. And I was really fascinated by the way that they too, just like my telephone operators, they too were not able to vote. That was denied to them. It was also denied to a lot of men who were not men of property. There were a lot of men who were denied as well, just not because of their sex, but because of their rank, where, their income and all of that, the accidents of birth. So I thought it was fascinating too that they wanted to fight for king and country. They wanted to do their bit to defend their country and also to hasten the end of the war so that the men that they loved would be able to come home. So, I mean, every day they shortened the war meant more lives saved. And that could be they could be the life of someone they loved. So when I was learning about these women who served in the munitions plants, I was fascinated by this subset of these women who were known as the Canary Girls. And this was an affectionate term. It was meant as an endearment, acknowledging their contributions. But the women who worked in the danger buildings or the danger rooms, working with TNT, or as they called it, the yellow powder, they were the ones it was very dangerous work. I mean, when you're working with explosives, you know that there's an inherent danger involved. One spark could set off the entire plant and just level everything, sometimes for blocks around. So any work with explosives was inherently dangerous, but the women who worked with the yellow powder, they began suffering unexplained symptoms. Well, for the first thing that was the most obvious and the one that earned them their name was that their skin began to turn a lurid shade of yellow. And at first, this was considered a cosmetic issue. Well, of course, they're working with yellow powder. It's getting into their skin and it's turning yellow. But there were other symptoms as well: GI issues, migraine headaches, sore throats, all sorts of aches and pains, and just weakness, loss of appetite. And then one thing that was especially horrifying was that some of these women who worked in the danger rooms, they gave birth to yellow-skinned babies. Now, pregnant women were not supposed to be working it with the TNT, but the pay was so good and the desire to do their bit was so powerful that a lot of them concealed this to the extent that they could, as for as long as they could. And that was what really made it clear this is not a cosmetic issue. And so, to their credit, the War Department and the factories undertook intense medical evaluations. And that's when they discovered that the yellow was actually what they called toxic jaundice. It was a symptom of organs failing, and that the women were being poisoned by working with the TNT. And, they try to take different measures to alleviate the danger, increasing air circulation, having the women trade off, shift in and out of the danger buildings and, rotate people in and out so that everyone's exposure was lessened. Of course, it would expose more people, but the one thing they could not do, they could not stop building bombs because the Germans, the Central Powers, they were not going to stop building bombs. And it was essential. It had to go on. It was truly essential war work. So women, if they wanted to, or if they could no longer continue work because they were just so debilitated by the illnesses, and of course some of them died. Some of the women died from this. They were allowed to leave and take less dangerous work if they chose. But what I found just astonishing and incredibly moving was that so many women, knowing the dangers, knowing the risks, they stayed on the job. And in later interviews, some interviews at the time, and then later as oral histories were being taken of these women decades after the war, just a common statement that they would make in wording it in one way or another was that the lads do their bit in the trenches. The lads risk their lives in the trenches. We risk our lives in the arsenals. And so they stayed on the job because if not then, if they weren't doing the work, who would do it? And they saw this as their wartime service. And even knowing the dangers, and I thought that was just absolutely heroic, absolutely heroic. And I wanted to share their stories so that it would, of course, in Great Britain, in the Imperial War Museum and so many other memorials, they are absolutely giving these women the credit that they deserve. But at the time, they had to keep their work absolutely secret because if they said too much, spies for the, German spies could learn enough that could undermine their work. There could be sabotage. So they couldn't say anything. They couldn't even let their family members know, in many cases, what they were doing. If there were accidents that cost these women their lives, they weren't celebrated in the newspapers. There weren't parades held in their honor. So it was only after the fact that people began to learn, what their great aunt or what their great grandma did in the war. And I, like in so many cases with my historical fiction, I thought these are women I want to celebrate. These are women that I want other people to know about. I try to, whether I'm working with a historical figure that I'm using fictitiously or an entirely fictitious character, as in the case of the Elm Creek Quilters, I try to be true to that person, that character as I know them. If it's a historical figure, I try to learn as much about them as they can. And then I try to be true to what I know is documented and real as I am creating their imagined life. And then I do that with fictitious characters, entirely fictitious characters as well. I try to know them as a person. Fully as I can. And then I just, try to imagine not what I would do in a particular situation, but what this character would do, what this person would do, and what that person would do, how they would interact, how they would speak to each other, and what actions would they take in a given situation. So, I try to be true to the historical record as much as I can in my historical fiction. But then, of course, there's always these places where there are gaps in the historical record, or there's no way a particular thing was ever in the historical record, like innermost thoughts and particular conversations that weren't recorded. So the author's imagination always comes into play in these kind of places. And, I try to be true to the character as I know them. And, is this dialogue, does it feel real to the character that I've created on the page? And does this feel authentic, this interaction with this other character? And if it is, if my answers to those questions are yes, it stays in the book. If the answer is no, this doesn't ring true for this person as I've created them on the page, then it either gets tossed or it gets changed until it does ring true for that character.